welcome to our next session, Anti-Racism for Beginners. My name is O.C. Wheatfall. I'm the Facilities Operations Director at Texas A&M University, and I'll be your session monitor for this. I've already mentioned to folks coming into the room, if you could please change your screen name to your first and last name, just so people can identify you and we can call on you. And if folks want to continue the conversation, they know who to contact. At the end of this session, as with always, I will post in the chat the link for the evaluation. Please, if you can do us a real big favor and fill it out. It goes a long way in making these conferences and presentations a lot better. So thank you ahead of time. And without further ado, I would like to, sorry, let's back up. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Oh yeah, shoot, I'm controlling it. Duh. Yeah. Sorry about that.
It's all right. I want to thank our generous sponsors, like we've mentioned since the beginning of this conference. Through them, we've been able to make this conference completely free for everybody. So really appreciative of that. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenters. Our first one hails from the University of Kansas, where he serves as a senior coordinator of operations, Mr. Jeremy Chance. And then our second presenter from the University of Southern California, David Pachun, who serves as a membership, sales, and service coordinator. Gentlemen, you can take it away.
All right, thanks, so yeah, David's sitting in that little bit of a warmer weather than the rest of us. But anyways, thank you and welcome to our presentation. We're really appreciative of y'all joining us here for our session of Anti-Racism for Beginners during our Region 4 virtual conference. So the purpose really of today's session is really it might be serving as a starting point for some who may be new to social justice work, maybe reinforcement for others, solidifying the foundation of the work you've already been doing. Regardless of where you are in your journey, we hope it's a source of hope and optimism for all. So just a couple of reminders before we get going through. The session is being recorded, so just to be aware of that. And we'll obviously have the chat going, so feel free to message one of us if you want to address something privately with us. You've already got your Zoom names changed, so we'll go ahead and dive in. Just a brief overview of what's in store for our 60-minute session today. Again, the purpose behind today's session is to provide that foundational information to keep the conversation going, or maybe even get it started for some, hopefully not started, hopefully it's already happening, but to keep that conversation going in the realm of anti-racism work and social justice. So a breakdown for the 60-minute session ahead. Dave and I will kind of do a little quick introductions of ourselves and a little bit of info about us, where we're coming from. We'll touch on some of those learning outcomes, diving into our community standards and guidelines for the conversation. Part of this will be conversation, but there will be education, lecture portions of it as well. We'll highlight some action items, just a few key words to remember on your social justice journey. Then we'll dive into that education, really going to be the concepts and terms, the foundational work for starting your work or your journey around anti-racism. Yes, it's going to feel lecture-y, but we hope that providing that baseline information for those that want to get involved but maybe aren't sure how or don't know the terms. And we're excited that y'all are with us here today, and we hope everybody walks away with something they can apply to their personal life or professional life. We will have some discussion. We're going to use some polls now that we've got those figured out. And then we'll dive into some calls to action, those tangible things for y'all to do and consider. And then of course, we'll be available for questions at the end. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to David.
Hi everybody, how's it going? I'm David Pachun and I work at USC, like they said. I'm the Membership Sales and Services Coordinator currently. But I originally am from Region 4, so I went to the University of Kansas for my undergrad, and then I went to North Texas for grad school, so I spent some time over there, and then I actually came to Los Angeles, then went back to Kansas, now I'm back in Los Angeles, so I've been back and forth a few times, but really moving around to different regions of the country has really kind of impacted my own personal journey when it comes to anti-racism work and DEI work. Growing up in a small town in Kansas, you could imagine that, I wasn't exposed to a lot of diversity. I grew up pretty, sheltered life, a town of like 10,000 people. So Then I went to University of Kansas, like I said, but really it wasn't until I got to grad school and my first professional job out here in LA that I was really around more diversity and really started to realize my own privileges and started to believe in educating myself and taking those extra steps to make sure that I could understand some things related to DEI and anti-racism work, and also use my privilege to help others as well understand some of those things. So you may be asking yourself, why are two white guys talking about anti-racism? And I'm going to give a few different reasons, but really there's a lot more. One being, the primary reason is probably that racism is really a white problem. And I truly believe that. And it's something that, white people need to step up to the plate on, and really isn't going to be fixed until that happens. So, secondly, I think that, while Jeremy and I haven't lived a lot of these experiences, that makes it even more imperative for us to educate ourselves on, what other people are going through, challenges that other people face that we may not personally have faced ourselves. So I think that's a big responsibility on people who maybe come from a point of privilege like we do. It's not something to make ourselves feel good. It's not something that we do because, it's just because it's something that we truly believe is the right thing to be doing. Some of this work on our campuses and our personal lives. It's not just, something that we're doing for work. It's, goes through all levels of our lives. For me personally, I have a Black wife, I have a Black son, and another one on the way. So, as everybody who's a parent knows, you want your kids to grow up in a better world than you're growing up in, or have more, hopefully a more equitable world to grow up in. So that's a big motivating factor for me as well on more of a personal level. I'll turn it back over to you, Jeremy, to do a little intro.
Yeah, so I'm Jeremy Chance. I use the pronouns he, him, his. And I'm what I say new-ish to social justice. Again, I grew up in not rural. I grew up in suburban Indiana, but I think I was maybe naive or ignorant is probably the better word to identities in general, but especially identities other than mine. Until I was in grad school, similar to David. I did my master's at the University of Houston, and being in a city as diverse as Houston is, I think it really, and with just the education of earning that master's degree, I think it really broadened my perspective and knowledge of those identities, and it helped me, again, similar to David, acknowledge that the privileges that I hold as a straight, white, able-bodied, cisgendered male, and all those privileged identities that I hold, and using those to then be able to advocate for those marginalized identities. About me, husband, I've been married about 4 years to my wife, and I'm a dog dad. We've got 2 rescue pit bull type dogs. I know we're starting to see the dogs of NERSA hashtag go around, so hopefully others share their photos. Family guy, I got 3 siblings and super close with my family that I'm unfortunately missing pretty significantly with the COVID pandemic happening. And then I'm a region hopper. I did my undergrads at Purdue University, so Region 3, U of H for Region 4, and then Dave and I kind of flip-flopped. I was out at UCLA, so out in Region 6 for a little bit before traveling back to the Midwest here in Region 4. So hopefully that provides just a little context about where we come from. And, David brings up a good point about, why are the 2 white guys leading this conversation? And like you said, the work, this is an us problem. We need to acknowledge those privileges that we have and use our platforms and our opportunities to advocate for those that don't have a seat at the table or don't get as loud of a voice. So we're not experts by any means, but we're passionate to make that to create change, to engage in the conversations, and to continue our own education. But with that, it certainly would be appropriate to have a conversation around race or anti-racism without acknowledging that many of our universities, including KU and USC, sit on lands that once belonged to indigenous people. So we take this time to honor, the tribes that are on the lands that we're on. So the Kickapoo, Osage, Kansa, Sioux, Chumash, and Tongva people. So, we'll go into our learning outcomes quickly for you. So, develop an understanding and working knowledge of key terminology and concepts surrounding this anti-racism work. offer opportunities for self-reflection and resources for individuals to develop an understanding of their own identities and points of privilege. And then finally, provide some opportunities and examples for how anti-racism can be present on our campuses and how that can impact you and your own staff. So we won't necessarily go into, I won't read all of the community standards to you. This is generally for when we're in a large room physically together and having these conversations in small group discussion, but there's a few that we're hoping to really impactful or you take away from. Listen actively and attentively. We know that in this remote setting, it's easy to get distracted. So we ask and hope that you listen and stay engaged. And get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Race tends to be a difficult conversation, but hopefully that's where we see that progress happen, is when you make yourself uncomfortable and see that growth happen. Like we said, the chat is available. So if you have questions about something that you may not understand or want to share privately, feel free to send that in the chat message. Okay, we'll dive into our action items. First is we're going to focus on these first two. That's going to kind of be what today is all about, is setting those steps. So the first is going to be to educate yourself. Joining us today for this conversation, hopefully that's a start. Once I transition to David's portion of the presentation, I'm going to drop a PDF in the chat just with some resources and some definitions for you to have. But hopefully, again, you're taking this opportunity to educate yourself and seek out those resources without putting the burden on our colleagues of color. I know a lot of times we rely on our offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these offices are great and they're doing really great work. They can't be burdened with all the work. They're tired of having just to deal with all of this stuff day in and day out. So again, I think that's why David and I as white people are trying to shoulder some of that burden as much as we can to carry this conversation and do the work. And then listen, listening to those people that are on your campus, your students, faculty, staff, the members of your community, and seek out voices that may be different or different identities to yours. Specifically both to David and I, with USC, there's a Twitter handle, Black@USC, and then there's a hashtag Black@KU, and it's Black students, faculty, staff talking about their experiences on their respective campuses. And it's really eye-opening that, people that look like me may not necessarily understand or be able to put themselves in their shoes. So on the campuses that we're in. So making sure you're seeking out those voices on your campuses and listen and believe their experiences and center their experience. It's not, a lot of times we'll kind of, as white people, will try and center our feelings, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But we need to make sure we're centering the experiences of our Black colleagues on campus. And then advocate, using our privilege and power that we have in the positions that we hold and the identities that we hold, to advocate for those that don't have that power and we can't do it themselves. And then real action, that's the goal. So hopefully this is the first time you're seeing this work that NERSA has done, their identity wheel. We'd certainly be remiss to not mention the incredible resource guide that the EDI Commission put out. I think it's been a couple of years ago now, but this identity wheel is one of those really great resources. Just kind of breaking it down at the centers at Social Justice 101, and we'd like to think today's session is exactly part of that, right? We're establishing that foundational knowledge and the definitions that really is that foundational information. And then they created, you call them spokes on a wheel. I like to call them pizza slices. They've identified 10 pizza slices that represent different identity groups. And they've got the 10 here listed. Race and ethnicity is only one piece of that pizza. But we know that at times it may make up a larger percentage than some of those others. And this isn't a finite list of 10, and each of these pizza slices may not be relevant to each and everybody. There may be others. There's tons of other ones that can be identity can be added. But these are the 10 that NERSA highlights. Not all pieces are equal. Again, some of these may make up a greater percentage than some of the other identity groups. And it's also important to know that not all pieces stay the same amount in all situations. So depending if you're in a situation where you're one versus another, maybe your race is able to take up a larger percentage of your identity. In another scenario, maybe it's your gender, your religion. So knowing that the percentages given to each of those identities may vary depending on the situation that you're in. And then that green outer band surrounding the crust, we'll call it the crust of that pizza. It's the communities and dialogue for conversation, working towards the common good. So again, that's hopefully what we're here doing. And then it has those little parcheesi slices, but the different levels throughout the wheel. And I think the first, again, it's here what we're doing here is just creating awareness, establishing what the concepts, the basic terminology. That's really what today is. Kind of once you advance to that next level of inclusion, that's creating opportunities for those underrepresented identities on our campus to have a seat at the table. And the advocacy, that third level out, is where we're really changing or impacting at the systemic or the policy level. We're really advocating for equity, diversity, and inclusion. So with that, we'll go ahead and, OC, if you want to go ahead and launch our first poll. Thinking back to that identity wheel, like we said, NERSA has identified those 10 identity groups, those 10 pizza slices rather, with each of those pizza slices making up a different percentage. So using this poll, first question is, which of the three, or pick your top three components that you think identities that you most identify with most of the time. Whether it's your nationality, your education, race, gender. Go ahead and choose your top three or up to three. And then that second poll question that we'll bring back this answer later on. Just talk, what does your department currently do around anti-racism work? Let's go ahead and take a moment or two to check out your top three. Hopefully, OC, you're seeing those come in.
They are.
All right, we'll give it another minute or so. And does it seem like we have a good number of responses in so far, OC?
Yep, we got over 80%.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and pop up those results for right now.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so you see race and ethnicity kind of taking that 75%. Ability, education, gender, again, making up those larger portions most consistently. And then looking down, we'll look at that, the response to that second question later on once we dive into that a little bit. But I think this is helpful, kind of creates the context for who we have in the room, the virtual room, and moving forward. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it to David to dive into some of the definitions.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. All right, so we're going to start out just with some basic definitions. Racism, couple definitions here. Basically, it's a combination of racist policies and ideas that produce normalized racial inequalities or inequities, and when two or more groups are not standing on equal footing. And then on the contrast to that, anti-racist ideas are ones that support anti-racist policies through their actions or expressing those ideas. Being anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and self-examination. And I think hopefully some of that will be done today. And this is something that you have to kind of be ongoing. Like, even we gave a similar presentation a few months ago, and even from then to now, I've learned a lot, and I've changed things in the presentation. Jeremy and I have had other discussions related to this. So it's just kind of something that you can't just do one training and then be like, all right, now I'm good, I'm cool, I'll be, for the rest of my life, I'm good on this. It's something that you have to continue to be aware of what's going on and continue to educate yourself. Good. All right, so here's a quote from Robert Patterson, who's a Georgetown professor. And he said that anti-racism is an active and conscious effort to work against multidimensional aspects of racism. And I think what's telling about this quote is that it's really oftentimes the things that are unintentional, overactions, unconscious biases, or things that people don't always necessarily even realize that they're doing or saying that make up a large proportion of what racism takes place. You know, everybody knows when some certain like large circumstances or a very racist action takes place, or somebody says something overtly racist, it's pretty obvious. But it's those smaller things that oftentimes build up over time. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. Another great author, Ibram Kendi, who's written a couple of books, and he has a few quotes that I wanted to read. And the first being, "A racist or anti-racist is not who we are, but what we are doing in the moment." So that just goes to kind of talk about, you know, what I was talking about, continually educating yourself, continually doing this work. It's not something that you just do once and stop doing. And then another quote from him is that there's no such thing as a not racist policy, idea, or person. All policies, ideas, or people are either being racist or anti-racist. So you're either working towards that racial equity and that anti-racist agenda, or you're upholding the inequity that already exists, because that basically exists in every facet of our lives and our kind of social constructs, university systems, our work. You know, a lot of things are built on racist, systemic racism. You can go on to the next. So what does it mean to be anti-racist? So not racist versus anti-racist. There's a few differences here. I think one being that being just not racist versus anti-racist, it signifies some neutrality. It's more complacent, like, okay, well, you know, like I said, everybody can kind of point out those really extreme cases of racism, like we've seen in the last few months, a lot of cases of, you know, men being murdered by the police, women being murdered by the police, you know, hate crimes, the KKK, things that everybody knows are racist. It's one thing to look at those and say, I would never do that, I'm not racist. And it's a whole other thing to actually take action and try to fight actively against those things, or against the systems that kind of allow those things to take place. Saying that we are not racist, that's not going to end racism, simply put. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's a continuum that somebody created a few months ago. I saw it on Twitter. And it kind of shows the different kind of growth zones, or different zones of on your way to becoming anti-racist. So I think a lot of people, you know, were sitting somewhere in that fear zone of like kind of avoiding it, denying that it exists, or just kind of, you know, if it doesn't affect you, then you don't talk about it type of thing. And I think a lot of people have moved into that learning zone, especially in light of some of the recent events. But this is not, you know, an issue that's happened in the last 3 months. Nothing has really changed. It's just, I think a lot of people are becoming more aware of it. So I think a lot of people are moving into that learning zone, which is great. And I think the ultimate goal is to kind of get into that growth zone where you're educating yourself, but then also, okay, well, I feel empowered to say something when I see something wrong, or to advocate or to promote anti-racist policies in my workplace, or to be uncomfortable and to talk about these things with people who you may want to talk about them with, your family, your coworkers, people that are kind of in your sphere of influence. You can just skip that slide, Jeremy. So continue on with some kind of definitions. Privilege. So a lot of these definitions we've taken from the NERSA guide as well. So Jeremy mentioned that, but it's a good resource for people, and it goes over way more than just anti-racism or just these type of issues, but there's a ton of different social justice type issues, and it goes over a lot of different definitions and resources as well. So it's a really good resource to take a look at, and I think that it's linked on the NERSA website, but it may be on Jeremy's sheet that he shared as well, the PDF. But just to kind of dive into some of these. So privilege is essentially access to resources, that are only available to certain groups, certain social groups. It's a system of advantage that's given to people in those groups, and on the converse, it's a system that excludes people that aren't in those groups. So you'll see people also often talk about allyship or being an ally, and I think there's some differences between allyship and anti-racism, or kind of taking it a step further to advocacy. And allyship is more focused on understanding. Maybe you may confront some issues of racism, but it's more along the lines of empathizing with people, understanding people, or coming to some sort of understanding, but it may not take it to that next level of actually taking action. There's a author, Rachel Cargill, who said, we really need to start shifting the word from ally to accomplice. To not just saying, I hear you, I see you, you know, I see what's going on. Instead, it needs to be, I'm here alongside you to upend the system that's killing you every day. So it's not just a checkbox to say, like, I've gone through this training, I understand what issues people are facing. It's taking that next step to actually taking action. You can pull up the next thing. And then along with that is a definition of performative is essentially something that's being done without commitment. So ever since, especially since George Floyd was murdered, there's been a lot of universities and companies and everything coming out with some sort of statements or something to address racism. And whether or not those statements actually result in real change, or there's actually a commitment to making those changes or continuing that conversation, or if it was a one-time statement, is kind of goes back to whether it's a performative action or if it's something that's actually becoming like a real substantial change in a way of life. A lot of universities do unconscious bias trainings or things along those lines, where it's like a one and done training and you're just kind of trying to get that check mark and that checkbox to say that your staff have done this training or whatever the case is. And that can be a performative action as well, because there's no ongoing commitment to actually making those substantive changes. This is a tweet from, it was before we did the first version of this training, so it's been a few months now, but really spoke to me because it's talking about, you know, you see a lot of these things that are happening, like the people painting Black Lives Matter on the streets in certain cities, or really just shows of action, but that are more empty than, or trying to get people to kind of forget about the real issues, or to not keep pushing, or to not keep challenging the systems that are in place. If you look at within your own universities, within your own departments, or, you know, local governments or cities, you know, is it something that, you know, a lot of people made, like I said, made a statement, or most universities came out with something after George Floyd's murder, but is that something that was just a one-time statement, or is that something that the university is committed to making changes and actually continuing to have these conversations around anti-racism and around the work that needs to be done? Okay, so talking a little bit about marginalized identities, and we talked a little bit about privilege before, but a person's identities basically make up various groups, like we talked about. Jeremy shared that example of that kind of pizza pie of different identities. And to somebody who has a marginalized identity is basically being relegated to an unimportant or powerless position. And intersectionality is how your different identities react with each other, how they overlap. It can also be the way that race or racism intersects with your other social identities or other forms of oppression for some people, or points of privilege. So all of us have kind of intersecting identities, and depending on the situation, or depending on, you know, what type of group that we're in, even there can be levels of privilege, or what levels those identities show up in kind of makes a big difference. And I remember the poll showed a lot of people said that race was a big identifier for them. A lot of people said that in certain situations, different things made up different portions of that pie. So intersectionality is basically how those things interact with each other. And just a definition, I know that when I first was doing some of this work, I didn't know what BIPOC meant, and so it just stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. All right, so the last kind of section of these definitions, we're going to focus a lot on white privilege, and because, like I kind of said earlier, racism is really a white problem, and it needs to be addressed that way, I think. And going along with that, there are some definitions of different things that often show up. It can be in the workplace, it can be in personal life, but some things that often show up that really can be forms of microaggressions, or can be other issues that can come out of these. So the first being white guilt. So it's kind of a feeling of shame or remorse white people experience when they recognize the legacy of racism and racial injustice, or they perceive the way that they may have benefited from it, or them or their family may have played a role in it. And it's just kind of more bringing that conversation back to the white person versus, moving forward and figuring out, how we proceed as a society to kind of undo some of those injustices. So white tears, and I put white women tears because that's often the way it's referred, but it can really go across genders to any gender identity. And it's basically tears shed or figurative tears shed in a setting where people are frustrated, angry, or sad about how hard racism is on white people. So it's basically kind of flipping the script on, again, centering the white person in the conversation and how hard it is on them to kind of come to terms with racism. It can also be a form of gaslighting, which is basically manipulating somebody and forcing them to question their own thoughts or the events that have taken place, or making them question their own sanity or feel crazy for bringing up situations that they've been in. So white fragility is a discomfort and defensiveness on the part of the white person when confronted about racial inequities and injustice. And I think, a lot of us have probably been in situations where, white privilege, or the first time you may have heard somebody talk about white privilege, you get a little defensive and you think like, I'm not, that doesn't include me because, I grew up in a certain situation, or, I grew up without, socioeconomic status or these other points of privilege, when that really has nothing to do with white privilege at all. That's going back to intersectionality. We all have different levels of privilege in different areas, but whether or not I have a different religion or whatever the case may be, my different identities, that still is a point of privilege for me as a white man at all times. So white solidarity, that's basically unity as a group on the basis of community interests or objectives or standards, white people taking up for white people, expecting that white people are always going to side with each other, or people are going to side with you. It can be on a small scale or a large scale. I can think of a personal experience that I had recently after we moved to Kansas, my wife and I. We were in Kohl's, and we were buying like some towels, hand towels or something like that. So we get to the register. They were supposed to be on sale, but it wasn't ringing up correctly. It was like $3 off, by the way. So that kind of sets the conversation. So the clerk gets the manager comes over. She's like, oh yeah, he has to put in his code or whatever. My wife addressed him, says like, we're just trying to get whatever discount. Can you put in the code? He responds like, I'm not going to give you guys the discount. And we're like, okay, well, somebody already went back and looked at the rack and confirmed everything. All you have to do is put in your code. Like, I know you can do that. It's not a big deal. It's literally $3. But he's going back and forth with my wife, talking to her, and then he starts to talk to me. So he's just talking, basically completely tries to push her out of the conversation. The Black woman just pushes her out, starts trying to talk to me. I'm like, I'm not the one talking to you. She was talking to you. So that's not, obviously he was trying to get some form of like I don't know if he thought I was going to side with him because we're both white men or what the deal was. But that's what it felt like. So, and then out of nowhere, we're talking to him, you know, nobody's really raising their voice. It's not confrontational. It's just a regular customer service situation. He's like, you guys just need to leave or I'm going to call the police. And I'm like, what? Like, I'm 27, 28 years old at the time. I'm like, this is just a regular customer service situation. Why are you threatening to call the police? My wife was upset, obviously. So as we leave, I'm just more like, what? Shocked, like surprised. This is weird. But she, you know, for her, it made a whole different impression. And the fact that he would use that, you know, the fact of calling the police on a Black woman, which, by the way, this is the first time this has happened and not the last. And that really, for me, was like eye-opening because I'm like, I would have never been in this situation by myself. First of all, he would have probably just come up and given me the discount because that's the way it works. That's kind of the system that we're in. But also, you know, the fact that he even threatened to call the police was crazy to me. But that's the life, you know, that's for something for her was completely a different feeling. She was upset and angry that, you know, it had gotten to that, and basically that he had used that as an excuse or used that as a point of fear in the situation when it wasn't even a confrontational situation. Another example of white solidarity that I can think of is Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the national anthem, and you know, everybody had this expectation that, oh, the white players aren't going to kneel because it's not a white issue, it's a Black thing, you know. And then even when some of the white players did speak out or have knelt, they weren't met with the same level of standard of, you know, they didn't lose their jobs for it. Kaepernick's been 4 years now, and he's not back in the NFL. That's not the same energy that they get for the white people that have knelt. So having those kind of like expectations that all white people are one or all white people are going to like stand together on these things is crazy to me, but also is a big issue. So white centering, a little bit similar, is basically taking and centering your white feelings over people of color. There was an author that wrote in The Guardian that it is when feelings of white people, expectations of white people, and the needs of white people overtake those of people of color in important discussions. And I think that's important as well. White splaining. So basically, I'm sure you probably all heard of mansplaining. It's basically the same thing. To explain something or comment on something in a condescending or overconfident or inaccurate, even oversimplifying manner from kind of overshadowing the perspective of the group one identifies with. White fear. So basically, white fear is using somebody's using whiteness as a weapon, using authority as a weapon, calling the police on people. I gave my example earlier, and like I said, that's not the only time. That has also happened to my wife in other regular customer service situations that would never happen to me. And white people often, there's the example of the woman in New York City who called the police on the Black man who was bird watching and made sure to stay on the phone. There's a Black man here threatening me. So she was using that as a weapon. And I don't think that it's necessarily that there's a legitimate fear. I don't think anybody was scared of in certain situations, but I think that white people use that fear of authority to as a weapon against people of color, and when they believe that they're in a space that they shouldn't be in. Just a quote by Jane Elliott, who's done a lot of anti-racist work and activism. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions. And microaggressions, there's a little definition there. It's typically, it's something that you can expect somebody to represent or speak for an entire race. You make assumptions about somebody based on their race or derogatory remarks, negative slights. Like I said before, these are those small things that build up over time that are experiences that people have. And even just invalidating those experiences or playing them off as minor or insignificant in itself is a microaggression that can be done by people that come from a point of privilege. The microaggression does not mean less than. It just simply means that it's in the everyday. So I know a lot of people experience certain things on an ongoing level, and it's also important to remember that it's cumulative. So the impacts of these things accumulate over time, and as they continue to happen. And it's really indicative of a larger structural problem with racism and white supremacy. And it trickles all the way down to these small, everyday occurrences that happen to people. And it needs to really be something that we disrupt and something that needs to be called out by people, especially people of privilege, need to be calling these instances out. Macroaggressions, on the other hand, are basically larger acts of racism towards everyone of a race or an entire race. And going along with microaggressions, oftentimes there's this conversation of intent versus impact. So what you intended by saying something, or the level of insult that you may have intended, or whatever the case is, doesn't always meet with the same level of how it impacts the individual, or what you're saying, may be just misguided or something along those lines, but it doesn't mean that it's not impactful to that person. So really, you should be judged on the impact that it has on the person and not your intention. People often have excuses like, I didn't mean it like that. I thought, I didn't, that's not what I meant, or I meant this. But you really taking accountability for those things when they do happen, or when you do say things, is important as well. It's just, there are many forms of racism, unconscious bias, unintentional at times, but it doesn't mean that they're any less impactful.
Kind of on the light, kind of going back to our topic of microaggressions, I think for our colleagues who may identify in some of those marginalized or minority groups, may not be strangers to microaggressions, and I'm sure experienced some. But I think this video is one that lightheartedly flips the switch, or flips the script, and kind of puts it into a microaggressions against white people.
So you're not good at golf, but you're white. People of color have to deal with racial. So you're not good at golf, but you're white. People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes, which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So like, where are you from?
No, like, where are you really from?
Why do you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent.
Your English is really, really good. It's like I can't even tell you have an accent or anything.
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word in European?
Like, what does that even mean?
Hey, Connor, you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo?
Act entitled in the supermarket.
I love white food. No real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy.
You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp. Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my God, so it just does that? No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know who you look like? Kenny Chesney.
Zach Braff.
Emma Stone.
Rachel Maddow.
My friend Chad. Maybe you know him because he's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not Macklemore. What's the other guy?
Is it Emma Thompson?
It's CHAD, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer.
How does it feel to be the token white guy in the office?
Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this?
I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun.
What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried meth. But you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white, though.
You're not really white.
I'm whiter than you are.
So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture.
Bryce, back me up on this one. The thing you have to understand about white
No,
culture
I
is
went
that
to
white
an
people are...
historically white college, so
Okay,
I know about
but I
white culture.
backpacked
Okay, I
in
was
Europe.
So can you say how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life. If you've ever experienced microaggressions because of your race,
All right, well, hopefully that's, again, just kind of maybe a lighthearted way to kind of frame it a little bit differently. So maybe you want to throw this discussion question out to the group. How might we see microaggressions in camp play out in our campus recreation settings? Again, feel free to drop responses in the chat if you feel comfortable. If anybody wants to, maybe want to chime in here. And that's okay if not. We've got a couple of discussion questions coming up here, but thinking about maybe how those microaggressions may play out in our intramural sports for sure is one example. Yeah, for sure. Keep dropping those examples in the chat. We'll move on to maybe some other discussion questions that we can generate some conversation around. So I'll turn it back to David for maybe one more definition.
Thank you. All right, so talking about advocacy. Advocacy is publicly supporting individuals or groups, bringing awareness to the general population. It can be institutional change, and it kind of differs. It's kind of a step before activism. Activism is more looking at those, societal changes, systemic racism, or changes that need to take place. But advocacy is kind of where we're pushing towards, especially in our campuses and in our work settings, is where is your sphere of influence and where can you advocate for those people, depending on, what position you're in or what level you're in as a professional, your impact that you can have within your local campuses and or your personal lives as well. It's not a static definition. So what you may be able to do in different circumstances or different levels and different venues may change, may be different as far as advocacy goes, but it's important to kind of find those spheres of influence that you do have.
All right, Osi, if you want to go ahead and throw up that second poll, and this is where we'll kind of really start to maybe dive in a little bit of discussion. Figure to answer, what is your department currently doing around anti-racism work or equity, diversity, and inclusion? Some really good feedback there in the chat about those microaggressions. OC, we'll defer to you on when to pop up the poll results there. You're on mute, so I'm not sure what you said.
We got about 75% already, so I'll go ahead and end it.
Sure. Okay. So we are seeing some work, which is really great, and I hope many of y'all, I hope you all on the call took advantage of the Nurses 21-Day Habit Building Challenge. I know our department at KU was doing those readings and then meeting at the end of the week to do those discussions. But hopefully it's good to see that most people here on the call are doing at least some work around anti-racism or equity, diversity, and inclusion. So with that, let's go ahead and maybe dive into some of the specifics Again, feel free to maybe drop some things in the chat, but maybe we'd love to hear some other voices other than David's and mine. So what are maybe some of the good things y'all are doing or in your department that really help live those values that we see in our mission, vision, value statements? And then, kind of in conjunction with that, how do we explicitly add in some of that anti-racism language or anti-racism work? Some good discussions on implicit bias.
Hi guys, I can jump in here a little bit to get it started. I know, so we've always had these values, especially of inclusion and diversity, and it wasn't until the pandemic hit and with having some quote unquote time to really devote to these, which, in one way it sucks because it shouldn't have taken something like that to have the space and the time to live your values and try to do the work around that. But at least it's the starting point. So we've done a lot of work with our staff, bringing in our Senator for Diversity and Inclusion, having conversations within just our staff as a whole. And our recreation department is part of our athletic department, and we have a Black AD, and we are in a historically white college. So making sure that, the responsibility doesn't fall wholly on him, but making sure that he's included in the conversation and that we are actually having the conversation, and working with our different student affinity groups to space and the resources to be able to, we launched a Woo Black group on campus, and we quote unquote allowed, but we supported them when they made some pretty bold statements and things that weren't entirely flattering to the department. And we help promote that, and they're in those conversations with them.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamaica, for chiming in. We appreciate that.
This is Miranda Price from Texas A&M University.
Hey, Miranda.
Hi. So I co-chair our DEI committee with James Nash, and the first thing I dropped in the chat was the discussions on implicit bias, but we've also had a couple of other discussions around some of these basic terminology, things that y'all have mentioned throughout today's training. And we are also working on ongoing trainings that we can continue to have throughout the year. Our committee just grew from 4 to 7, so that definitely helps out. Actually, that's like 8 or 9. Definitely helps out with having more people to do the work, because just to kind of share the love with all of this, but also to get in different perspectives. So we're not going to focus solely on race and gender, but trying to reach out and cover those other identities as well.
Yeah, no, Miranda, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. I think we're all kind of trying to avoid, I think David mentioned earlier, checking off that box of, with all staff training at the beginning of the semester, or, the remote or the online trainings that some universities require of doing, just check off that box, and is to continue that conversation throughout the semester. Maybe one other person, if there's anybody out there who wants to chime in on what are some other ways we can incorporate with either part-time staff or full-time staff. I know Brittany mentioned some aquatics, so maybe to call her out a little bit, if you want to chime in there about what specifically with those first aid rescues have you covered that was far from a diversity lens, Brittany?
Yeah,
to call you out.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Sure.
Yeah, we talked about racially inclusive bandages and the importance of inclusion with everyone in first aid. And we also talked about, with aquatics, when you're doing a save, you have that communication factor. So what do you do with international students, or, a visiting scholar that maybe doesn't have, the best English? Like, how do you help them in that scenario? Or if it's a deaf patron or hard of hearing, so how are you going to respond in those scenarios? So we covered those types of things, and also, helping patrons who aren't able-bodied. So it wasn't just focused around racial diversity, it was more inclusion as a whole. And our staff really took to that. We took some different scenarios off of the NERSA website and used some of those, and they really responded well to that.
Yeah, that's great. Again, we'll all stand for NERSA all the time, but utilizing that resource that's already been created, I don't think any of us need to recreate the wheel, especially when there's those resources that are out there. So thanks for responding to my on-the-spot call out for you. So we'll go ahead and just kind of wrap it up. I know we want to be conscious of everyone's time. But we'll kind of wrap up with our few calls to action. So, we ask that you this group to commit to being anti-racist and doing that anti-racist work, thinking about what does that mean for you in our professional settings. So with our colleagues, with our student staff, our professional staff that we may manage, but then our university communities. KU is a predominantly white institution, but that doesn't mean we don't have those other minority or identity groups on our campus. So how can we be anti-racist professionally, but also personally as well? I think this is something that obviously expands beyond our campus recreation worlds. And then continue to educate ourselves. David mentioned this earlier, the work can't stop just because we've attended a session or joined a conversation. We haven't learned it all, we've never arrived. So we just need to continue to educate ourselves and keep educating ourselves. And then having those meaningful discussions with colleagues and friends and family. Now as we head into next week with the election, I think it's certainly a politically charged conversation, and it can be a sensitive subject. But like we said, we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and having those conversations that, especially with those people that are closest to us and that we can potentially impact. And then we're taking take real action. So with that, we do have a few minutes to maybe open the floor for questions, any other commentary. OC dropped the link in the chat to rate and review our session, so we'd love that feedback. But wanted to open the floor if anybody had any questions or feedback on our topic.
In the meantime, if people are thinking of something, I just want to say something real quick, Jeremy. If that's cool.
Go right ahead.
So a couple things that kind of a little related to both few of the last slides, really. And I'm glad that somebody brought up the first aid conversation about doing something like that with your student staff, because I think for me, one of the more impactful things that we did, I know at KU we emphasized it, is having trainings centered on how these conversations apply to your job. So, you can give a presentation like this where students may or may not absorb as much information, but if you're relating back to situations, if you're doing an intramural training and you're relating to an officiating situation, or you're relating it back to a supervisory situation in an intramural game, or a coaching situation or something like that, then that seemed, for us at least, to have a much more broad impact on the students and get them to realize how these things aren't just, it's not just like a bunch of definitions. These come out in the work that you do, or may come out in the work that you do, and how to respond to those situations. So I think that was one thing that was meaningful that we did, which I appreciate somebody brought that up. And another thing was just within your sphere of influence. I think I kind of brought this up earlier, but no matter what level of staff you are, you have some sphere of influence. So whether that's your fellow staff members, your student staff that work directly for you, if you're higher up, maybe you have a larger influence in your division and your community. So using that to really impact these conversations, I think, is the most important thing each of us can do. And if anybody had any questions.
Yeah, one thing, David, I was going to add on to that, and I think, it's important that, more times than not, it's the people who attend this type of session or, kind of choose, those optional DEI trainings are the people who are passionate about the work or want to make that progress. It's the people who aren't showing up to this type of session or taking advantage of those opportunities that we need to be reached. So using, like David said, that sphere of influence to share this knowledge with those people. So feel free to shoot either one of us an email. They're listed there on the screen. If you have questions or comments, again, hopefully you'll provide that feedback in the link that OC shared. Otherwise, one last plug from the Communications Committee for our Region 4 social platforms. Ooh, Jared, that's a good question. David, I don't know if you're seeing it there. As far as resources used regarding policy enforcement.
That's a really good question. That's not supposed to be the last thing that you say at the end of the session. No, I think, that's something where reaching out to those offices you have on campus for a resource is one thing that is a good resource. I know the way that I respond to things has been influenced a lot by going through a lot of like campus trainings and things like that. That NERSA resource guide actually has some good resources for kind of like how to respond to situations. But I think you have to kind of look at it with that lens of like how you're, enforcing those policies and the impact that it's making on the people that you're enforcing them with, not just, what's the policy, but, what's the impact behind it. We don't make changes to our policies, for no reason. We do that, or we change the way we enforce them because we come to, some clarity on what those policies are and how they may be impacting different people differently. So I think that's something that we look at. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's something that I've made a point to look at when I'm looking at policies and things.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that NERSA, kind of a NERSA sponsored program here, but yeah, that EDI, that resource guide is really great. Touching on David's point, it has those practical examples of, hey, how can I apply this to the setting from an intramural official's perspective or from the fitness floor. So it really has those practical discussion questions and examples of how to apply that stuff. That's a great question. Thank you for that. If you have others, again, feel free to email us. Otherwise, we'll be conscious of your time. So thank you all for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of the conference.